Hello and welcome to the Blue Open Studio tutorial video series. The topic of this video will be FTP. In this video, we'll be discussing how the FTP feature works, properties of the FTP feature, built-in functions used to execute the FTP actions, and we will demonstrate configuring the FTP feature and transferring files via FTP. FTP stands for File Transfer Protocol. It is a standard network protocol used for the transfer of computer files between a client and a server on a computer network. There are built-in functions available in Blue Open Studio that allows the application to transfer files between computers using FTP. And you can configure default settings that are automatically loaded when the project starts up and that can also be restored as needed during runtime. These settings can also be configured during runtime by calling the CnfFTP function. And FTP transfers can be executed via the built-in functions. Before we configure the FTP feature inside of our Blue Open Studio application, we will first want to configure the FTP server for a user and access for the application. For this video, we are going to be using FileZilla as our server application for our FTP. As you can see by the screenshot of my desktop, I have both the server and client of FileZilla installed. And there are links below in the description of this video for downloading both. So what I'll do first is I will open up the FileZilla server interface. And when it comes up with the enter server to administrate. So it comes up with the essentially login prompt. We give it the host and the port, and all of this is default. I didn't change any of the settings from when I installed it, so I'll leave everything as it is, including the password, which is blank. And I'll click connect. And then we are logged into the server. And here we see a message about being behind a NAT router, and please configure passive mode settings in order to allow proper communication through your router. Essentially what this means is that we have a router that is directing the network traffic, and that can sometimes cause issues with FTP transfers. Thankfully for us though, everything is going to be local on the same machine. We're going to have our server and our BOS application running on the same machine, so we don't even have to worry about configuring this. However, if you do have to configure this with a remote FTP server, my recommendation is to consult your IT department to see what needs to be done. So once I'm into the FileZilla server, I will come up to the menu bar here and we'll see several icons. And the one we want is the fourth from the left. And this is the icon for the users. And when we bring it up, we get our user prompt, and we will create a single user that we're going to use. So I'll come over here to the users window and I'll click add. And then I'll put in a name, and I'll just use PFA. And you don't have to have any groups configured in order to set up a user. So since I don't have any groups configured, I'll just leave this set to none. And then once I have that configured, I will add a password, and it will be the same as the username. And then I will leave everything else set to default. But before I leave here, I want to go to shared folders. And here is the directory that we set as the root directory when we log in to the FTP server from our Blue Open Studio application or from any other FTP client. So I will click on add down here, and I will add a directory. And in this case, I am going to add my downloads as the directory. And you'll see once you add it, you have this H next to it. What that means is that is the home directory. And as I stated, this will be the initial directory that we connect to or log into when we connect to the FTP server. And the last thing that we need to do is configure our access rights for this user for this directory. So by default, read is selected for files, and for directories we have list, and then the plus subdirectories, meaning that we can browse through. Now with Blue Open Studio, unfortunately, we are unable to browse to other directories. So when we actually transfer a file to or from the FTP server, we have to give it the full path. So for us, what we will do is we will leave the directory set as is. And for the files, we will check all 4 of them. This will allow us to not only read files from the server, but also put files onto the server. And once I'm done there, I will click OK. And then you see here that it says that it's retrieving the account settings, then it's sending the account settings, and now it's completed. So now our server is configured. Now that we have the FTP server configured, we can now configure the FTP feature in our Blue Open Studio application and then create the screen that we're going to use. Before we configure the feature though, we are going to have to add in a tag class that we're going to use for this. So what I will do is in development, I'll go to the global tab and then right click on classes and select insert class. And the name I will give it is FTP. So we could type in the member names here, but what we will do actually to make it easier is we will copy the members out of a text file and paste them in. So I'll open an Explorer window and I will navigate to my training files, which in my case is on the C drive and in BOS Training Files. And I'll look for the text file called FTP class. When I open it, I will copy everything out of the file. And then back in my development, I will select on the first cell and I will paste. And now we have all of our members added in. Once I have that, I will close my class and then back in the Project Explorer, I will expand the project tags folder and double click on Datasheet View. And then I will add in a new tag called FTP. And for type, I will change it to the new class we just created, which is FTP. So now we have our class and tag created, and we will begin configuring the FTP feature. So I will close my tag list. And to get to the FTP feature, on the menu ribbon, we'll go to Project, and then click on Email/FTP. And then on the left-hand side here, we'll click on FTP settings. And we have 3 separate groups of information that we have to configure. The first is the account information. And this is that user that we configured just a little while ago on the FTP server. And we can also set tags for all of these fields. But to begin, we're going to simply put in static values so we can test our communication. So username, I will put in PFA. And as I click off of that to go to the password field, we'll get a data protection warning message. And essentially all this is saying is that data protection is disabled, meaning that sensitive information such as usernames and passwords aren't going to be encrypted. It is possible that they could be read if someone has the proper utilities to be able to read that information if it was being transferred back and forth. However, it's highly unlikely, but if you do want to take some additional precautions, you can enable data protection and set a password for it. And then it asks if you want to proceed with the settings that are not recommended. And in this case, I will click yes. And then for password, I'll enter in my password, which was PFA. And then for the server address, normally we would put in here the IP address of whatever server we're going to connect to. But since the FTP server resides in the same PC where this application will run, I can put in localhost. And that will tell the application that we're looking on the same machine as the application is running. Additionally, we could put in our true IP address or the home address, which is 127.0.0.1. It's called the home address or loopback address, and this points right back to the same machine. But for me, I'll go with the easiest one, which is localhost. And I will leave the port set to 21. And then down here we see an FTP mode. Now, I mentioned when we were first configuring the FTP server about entering passive mode because we're behind a NAT router. This is a similar setting here. And the difference between active and passive mode is sometimes security utilities, antivirus, or firewall softwares will prevent the connection because it sees it as a malicious or possibly dangerous communication. Setting it to passive essentially tells the security or firewalled, that the connection can be trusted, and this is what the connection is supposed to be doing. I will leave it set to active for now. If we do have problems when we communicate, I'll come back in here and set it to passive. And then finally down below, we have two fields under runtime. We have a status field, which will give us a status code for any FTP transfers or when the profile or configuration is reloaded. And then the reload field, which when the tag in this field changes value, it will reload this configuration into the runtime. And then we have a checkbox that says run this configuration when starting the runtime. By default, this is checked. So as soon as the application starts up, this configuration will be automatically loaded in. If we uncheck that, then we have to toggle this reload tag in order to load this into the application once it starts running. So we can either right click on these fields and select insert tag, or we can type them in. And they're going to be pretty easy. So I'm just going to type them in, and the status field will be ftp.status. And for reload, it will be ftp.reload. So we're using that FTP class tag that we created and the appropriate members, be it status or reload, for these fields. And then below this is a test button. And what this allows us to do is this allows us to actually test communication between this application and the FTP server. So when I click on it, it brings up an FTP testing dialog, and we can browse to a local file. And in this case, I'm going to browse to my training files, and I will pick the bosds.pdf file. And then for the remote path, we have to type this in. There's no way to browse to it. So I know from previous testing with FTP clients and servers that we can get to the home directory by just putting in a /. But after we enter in the /, we also have to put in the name that we want to give the file. It just won't simply transfer the file with the same name. We have to give it the name we want to use. So I will just type in the same name that it has, bosds.pdf. And then down below, we have three buttons. Put and get will allow us to either transfer the file from the FTP server, which is the get, or transfer the file to the FTP server, which is the put. And then OK simply closes out of the testing window. So what I'll do first is open an Explorer window, and I will navigate to my downloads so we can actually see when this occurs. And you see here that we don't have any files in here right now. So if I click on put, it says starting file transferred successfully. So now if I go back to it, we now see that we have our data sheet in the downloads folder. So I will test it the other direction now. So I will leave the remote path as is because this is the file that I want, but instead the local path, I will place it on my desktop, and I will give it a file name of test.pdf. And then I will click on get. Once again, starting file transferred successfully. So if I bring up my Explorer window again, we see in the downloads, our bosds.pdf file is there. Now if I go to the desktop, I see that my test.pdf file has been transferred. So we now know that the file transfer works correctly. So what we will do is click OK to get out of the testing. And we have our settings proper. So I'll click OK. So now that we have the FTP settings configured, we can create the screen that we're going to use to actually test the FTP at runtime. So we could create the screen from scratch, but an easier way would actually be to simply copy the screen in. And we have a copy of the screen in the BOS Training Files. So the first thing I'm going to do is close the Blue Open Studio development. And then I will open an Explorer window, and I will navigate to my training files. Then I'll navigate to the screen folder inside of there. And we see that we have several files. And what we want are the three files that are named FTP. And the three are ftp.scc, .tag, and .txt. And these three files are what are required in order for the screen to be created. The SCC is the actual graphics and layout of the screen. So what we see in the runtime, the visualization, they're stored here. The .tag file stores any tags that are used in that screen. This helps with cross-references and searches. And the txt file stores any strings of text, not tag names, but actual captions or labels or just text strings that are used in the screen. And this helps with finding, searching, and replacing of text strings. So what I will do is I'll select all three of them and copy them. And then I will navigate to my application folder. And then I'll go to the screen subfolder and I'll paste them in here. Once I paste them in, I will open up Blue Open Studio again. And now once I'm in, if I go to the Project Explorer on the Graphics tab, I expand screens, I now see I have a new screen called FTP. But before we open that, I'm going to go to my Navigation To screen and create the button to get to it. So I'll just simply copy the email button and then change the appropriate settings. So I'll change the open screen for the command animation from email to FTP. And then back on the button, I'll change the caption to FTP. So that's done. I will close this screen, saving it as I do, and then open my FTP screen. Now our FTP screen is already pre-configured with all of the fields and tags and scripting that we need to use. Now we'll review how these are set up as we go along. So the screen is laid out in three sections. The top portion are the FTP settings, which we've already set statically, so we will not be using this for our first demonstration. When we change the settings to use tag names, then we're able to configure the settings here and then load them in via this button. And then in the middle of the screen, we have our local and remote file paths. And we have two buttons. The first will select a local file, and the second will copy the local file name and drop it into our remote file path. This is just a shortcut way for us to easily rename the file without having to type it in. And then down below are two buttons that allow us to transfer either what I am calling in this demo application a download, which means going from the remote or server FTP to the local or client FTP station. And the upload is the reverse direction, going from the local or client FTP station to the remote or server FTP station. So we'll begin first by looking at the Select Local File button. And we use some VB script along with some built-in functions to configure this. So if you haven't already reviewed the scripting tutorial video, I highly recommend going and reviewing that first in order to get a better understanding of how this is laid out. So how this script is laid out is we're doing just two basic things. We are using a built-in function called rdfilen, which brings up a file browser that will allow us to select a file. And once we select it, it will return the full path, file name, and extension of the file that we've selected. And then we are popping up an error message if there is an error selecting the file. And once we select that file, what is happening is it is actually being put into the tag name that is configured for this text box. And we see that it's grayed out, so we can't change it. So the only way we can select the file is by going through the file browser. And then the copy selected local file name button, all that it is doing is popping up a message if no local file has been selected. And if a file is selected, it is stripping out the path and simply putting in the file name, including the extension. And that tag that stores this is the tag configured for this text box, which we also could type in manually if we wanted to. So if we wanted to use the same name as the local file, we would simply click this button. If we want to give it a different name, we would enter it in manually. So before we look at the two buttons for transferring the file, I first want to review the built-in functions that are used for our FTP feature. So I'll bring up the technical reference and I'll search for FTP, and then I will click on the result that says FTP functions. And we see that we have four. The CnfFTP, which is what is used to load in the configuration at runtime. So we'll look at that in a little bit. and then the FTP get and put, which are the two transfer functions, and then the FTP status. And this gets the current status of any file transfers that were started by either the FTP get or FTP put. So if we wanted to check the status for, say, we're transferring a very large file, we could use this function to do so. So we will first look at the FTP get. And the FTP get is for receiving a file from the server. And for this function, we have several parameters or arguments that we need to configure. The first is the remote file. So that's the full path, file name, and extension of the file we want to get on the server. And then the local file, which is the full path, file name, and extension of where we want to place the file when we transfer it. And then an optional transfer type. This is if we know the type of transfer we want to use. If we leave this option blank, it will use the unknown or 0 flag for the default value. And then the optional overwrite. If the file already exists on the local station, do we want to overwrite it, or do we want to just cancel the transfer? And then we see any returned values that we may get. Then down below, we have any returned values we may get for the function. And as you can see, anything other than 0 means that there was an error during the transfer, be it either a cancel or we couldn't overwrite the file, or one of the parameters was missing. At the very bottom, we see an example of how to configure the function. So we see that we have our paths inside of double quotes. So we will send it strings of these paths. We are going to be using variables or tag names in place of those two parameters, so we don't have to worry about that. So now if we look at the FTP put, we have very similar parameters than we saw for the FTP get. The only difference is the order in which they're listed for the function. So the first parameter is the local file. The second is the remote, and then we have our transfer type. Then you'll notice what is missing is the overwrite option. This is because of how the FTP server will handle that. When we set up our user, when we configured the FTP server, we gave it an option to append and delete files. So that will essentially handle the overwrite for us. If we're trying to save a file to the server that has the same name as one that already exists, it will automatically overwrite it. And that's based on how the server is configured. So that has nothing to do with how we're going to configure our Blue Open Studio application. And again, we have our returned values, which anything other than 0 means there was an error during transfer. And a couple of notes for both the FTP get and FTP put functions. Before we call these, we have to either run the CnfFTP function to load the configuration or set up the configuration ahead of time. And then both of them, the FTP put and FTP get, run asynchronously, meaning that they run outside of the normal process of the runtime. So in order to see how they're doing in the status or how much longer we have to run the FTP status function, which we'll look at in a second. And the last note is that neither one of these functions can be executed on the thin clients. So those are remote viewers, so that would be the secure viewer or SMA. When the data protection is enabled, this must be executed on the runtime server where the project resides. And we have some additional information under the enable data protection to encrypt sensitive information. So I recommend if you want to enhance your security or if it's required that you use this data protection, you take a look at that section of the manual for additional info. So if we look at the FTP status function, all that we see is we give it the optional string, the tag status parameter. And this is a string tag that will receive the text description of the current status of the file transfer. So we could have several transfers running at once. However, it's only going to retrieve back, I believe, the most recent. And then we see our list of returned values. This is different than what we get back in this tag if we configure one here. If we don't configure a tag here, we just don't get any description, and we'll get a return value, which will tell us one of numerous states. And these aren't necessarily error messages. There may be errors listed here, but these values here tell us a different message. So for example, a -7 is there was an error establishing a connection. A 5 is it's connected to server, and a 12 would be response received. And A note here, unlike the other FTP functions, we can call this function at any time, but it will not provide any useful info unless the FTP get or put have been previously called. And like the other two, this cannot be executed on the thin clients when data protection is enabled. And the last one we want to look at is the CnfFTP. And what this does is this allows us to load the configuration in at runtime. And here we have several parameters. We have our server address, our user and password, and these are optional. So if we don't have a user or password configured, we don't need to enter it in. And then the option for a passive mode. So the default is that it's disabled, so that's a value of 0. So if we enter a value of 1, passive mode's enabled. So by default, it uses active mode when loading in the configuration. And then an optional port. And if this is blank, it uses the default port of 21. And then the return values, which anything other than 0 means there was an error loading in the configuration. Then at the very bottom, we have an example. So now that we've looked at the functions, we'll take a look at the two buttons. And the two buttons are set up relatively similar. What we're doing first is we are running our function, in this case the FTP get, and we're putting in our remote file name, the local file name, the transfer type, and whether we want it to be overwritten or not. And you see here that I'm putting a / at the front. That's because in this tag, I'm only storing the file name and the extension. So in order to properly address it on the server side, I have to give it a path. And we're just remaining for this test in the home directory. And then what we're doing below that is just evaluating the return result. And if it's successful, we pop up a message. If it's not, we'll pop up an error message along with the error code. And then we're displaying the message box. And then for the upload, it's the similar layout. The only difference is we're doing a put, but we're using the same parameters, same tags in those parameters. And then once again, evaluating the result and displaying the appropriate message. So now what I will do is I'll close my FTP screen. And I didn't make any changes, but I'm going to save anyway. And I will start the runtime. So now I will snap my runtime to the right of my screen, and I'll snap my development to the left. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the FTP server again. So I'll minimize and then open up my FileZilla server interface. And this is just so I can keep an eye on activity from the server side. So on my runtime, I will go to my FTP screen and I will select my local file. See, it brings up a file browser and we are located in the application directory. And I'll select the bosds.pdf. I'll open that. And then for the remote file, I'll simply click on the copy selected file name. And what I am going to do before I transfer that is I am going to open up a Explorer window and navigate to my downloads. I'll make sure that that is removed. And then I'll just set it down here so we can see everything. And then I will select upload, meaning transferring it to the remote station. In this case, it should transfer it into the downloads folder. It says file received successfully. For my pop-up message, we see the log on the FTP server side, and then we see the file is located in our destination directory. So now if I try to upload again, file received successfully, it transfers it again. And you notice that it didn't have an error when it transferred, so it automatically overwrote the file on the destination. So now let's pick a different location. So I will leave it in this directory, but I will give it a new name of test.pdf. And then remote file I will leave as is because that's the file we want to grab. But in this case, I will now come back to my application folder. Now I will download from the server. File received successfully. We see the log showing up here and there's no red, meaning everything's good. And we look, and in our directory we have our test.pdf file. So now what we will do is we will configure our FTP settings to use tags instead of static values so we can dynamically change our settings at runtime. So I will close the window and the FTP server for now. I'll bring back up my development and I will stop my runtime. That's because we cannot change our FTP settings while the application is running. So then I will go back to the project tab on the menu ribbon, go to email/FTP, and then in the dialog, go to FTP settings, and then I will change all these fields to use tags. Now these fields are static fields, so we can't right click and select insert tags, so we have to type them all in manually. So for the username, and they all will have to be inside of curly brackets as well. So for the username, I'll put in ftp.username. Once again, I get the data protection message. I'll just click through it. Then for the password, inside of curly brackets again, ftp.password. And then server will be ftp.server. And then port, ftp.port. And we do not put a tag in here for active or passive, but that is a parameter, as we saw when we looked at it a little bit ago, for the CnfFTP function. So we'll just leave it set to active, and then we can change it when we load in the configuration at runtime. And I will leave everything else the same. Now, if we went to test this here, we would get an error because the configuration is invalid. So that is the one downside for entering tags in for these values. My recommendation is if you want to do it this way, test it with static values with a known user and password and server address that you're going to be using, and just make sure that it works. If it does, great, then put your tags in for these settings here and you're good to go. So I'll click OK to get out of here. And we don't have to change anything on our FTP screen, but we'll go in and review the top portion. Now, as I mentioned, we have fields for every parameter that we need to enter in: our server, port, our FTP mode, and our authentication. And then the load FTP configuration button, all that it is doing is running the CnfFTP function, passing our appropriate parameters, and then displaying a message whether or not it was successful in loading it or if there was an error. So I'll close my screen. And then I will once again start up my runtime. Then I will snap my runtime to the right and then snap my development to the left. And you notice in my output window, I get an error message that says the FTP configuration could not be applied due to the error -2. Please refer to the CnfFTP, I'll expand this to look, function documentation for more details about this error. Essentially what this says is that we have invalid parameters because we have no value stored in those tags, so we could not load in a setting. And the reason is because we did not uncheck this box. So if you are going to use these fields configured with tags, my recommendation is to uncheck this. And I will uncheck it now and click OK, but it won't apply that until the next time I run the application. So what I'll do here is I will navigate to my FTP screen, and then I will put in my information here. So for the server, I'll put in localhost. And you see when I hit tab, I tab to the password. That is because the tab order of these fields are not properly configured. By default, the tab order is how the objects are placed on the screen. So we will change that here in a minute. So for FTP port, I'll set that to 21. FTP mode, I'll leave set to active. Username, I'll put in my username, and then finally for the password, my password. And what I will do here is, once again, I will minimize my development, open up my server interface, just so I can get some status messages. And I will open an Explorer window. First thing I'll do is go to my desktop and I'll do a little cleanup. And then in downloads, do a little cleanup as well. And we'll run the same demonstration we just did. So for the local file, I will select in my application folder the bosds.pdf. And then make sure my remote file says the correct name. Before I click upload, I need to load this configuration in. So I'll click load FTP configuration. It says FTP configuration loaded successfully. So now I will click upload. It says file received successfully. We see the file show up and we see no red in our server log, meaning that the transfer was successful. And then I will once again change my local file here. And I'll do a little cleanup first, delete test, and then make sure my file name test.pdf is in there. And I get an error because it cannot find it. So what I will do is manually type it in. And that is a small little quirk about the RD file N. It flagged that we selected a file, and when I went to select it, it saw that the file no longer existed or it couldn't be found. So typing in versus clicking on and selecting a file makes a big difference when you're trying to select a location for just a file to be placed. So before I click on download, what I will do here is I will once again go back to my application directory. And now I'll click on download. We see a successful message, no red in our server log, and we see the test.pdf file appear in our application folder. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact ProFace America Technical Support by phone at 1-800-289-9266, option 2, or by email, support@profaceamerica.com. You can also visit our website, profaceamerica.com, for drivers, manuals, FAQs, and other product and software information. Thanks again, and have a great day.